Hello everyone, this is Dr. Lyons again, and what we're going to be getting into in chapter 13 is the start of a couple of chapters on how populations evolve and on evolution in general. So in chapter 13 we're going to get into kind of like the principal ideas of evolution and the principal concepts of evolution. In chapter 14, we're then going to get into how larger evolutionary processes happen, and we're going to get into why there are so many species on the planet to begin with. And then in chapters 15, 16, and 17, we're going to talk about how different groups of living things on the planet evolved. First we'll start with some kind of basic foundational concepts in evolution. That's what we'll discuss here in this chapter. So any discussion of evolution, of course, has to start with Charles Darwin. So let's talk a little bit about how he came to discover evolution and the fact that things on our planet evolve. So a lot of it was a boat trip, actually. So Darwin had some pretty wealthy parents, and those wealthy parents said, "Hey son, would you like to go on a boat trip all around the world?" And he said, "Oh, gee, thanks, parents. That'd be great if you could pay for that." And so that's what he did. So for something like 3 or 4 years, he went on this super long boat trip where they circumnavigated the globe in this boat known as the HMS Beagle. HMS stands for Her Majesty Service because they're in the UK, so Her Majesty obviously would be the Queen. At that time, it would have been Queen Victoria. Uh, and and so what they did is they started in Great Britain, went all the way down to South America, across the Atlantic coast of South America, up the Pacific coast of South America, out to the Galapagos. We'll talk more about that later. Across the Pacific, through the small islands in the South Pacific, to New Zealand, to Australia, to Tasmania, up kind of towards Indonesia, across to Africa, back to South America, because apparently once wasn't enough, and then finally back up to England. And what Darwin was doing on the boat was acting as the naturalist. So at that time, Europeans, not just from England, but from other European countries, they're sending out boats all over the place, and they're sending out naturalists to catalog the world around them, right? So these were like very basic sort of like exploration type trips that they were doing to kind of figure out what was out there, to map the world, and to figure out what living things there were out there. So that's the capacity that Darwin had on this boat. So he was essentially, writing down things he saw. He was taking samples. He was observing things and observing behavior of animals and looking at plants and doing a lot of cataloging of life all along this route that they took. And so the Galapagos Islands are particularly important to Darwin's journey and to his formation of the theory of evolutionary of the theory of evolution. And so the Galapagos, first of all, they are a chain of islands off of the Pacific coast of South America. They are across from that they are off the Pacific coast of Ecuador, right, which is on the Pacific coast of South America. Ecuador is called that because the equator runs through it, and so the equator runs through the Galapagos Islands as well. And so there's some interesting things that go along with the Galapagos in the flora and fauna, in the plants and animals that you find there. So what Darwin found was that a lot of the animals in the Galapagos were endemic, meaning that they were only found in that one place, right? They weren't found anywhere else. However, they resembled animals on the mainland of say Ecuador and Peru and in Chile, right? So they were similar to animals that you could find on the main continent of South America. So they're similar to those, but in their own particular flavor. A really great example of this is the Galapagos marine iguana. So these marine iguanas are only found on the Galapagos Island. And that's what this thing is right here. You can see that it has some differences between it and the South American iguana, which you find on land, right? So these iguanas, you've probably seen, you might have seen these before because a lot of people have them as pets. If you've ever been to Central or South America or the Caribbean, you've seen them all over the place because they're everywhere there. They're kind of like we have squirrels. They instead have iguanas. And the land iguanas, are built for living on land and for climbing up trees and eating vegetation out of trees. Whereas these marine iguanas are really good at swimming underwater and eating algae off of the seafloor, so eating marine plants. And they have some adaptations that help them do that, right? So for instance, if you look at the tail of this marine iguana, it's a lot broader from top to bottom, right? So the tail is almost kind of like a little paddle, kind of like the paddle that a fish has. Whereas the tail of a land iguana is circle shaped and not really useful for swimming. The feet of a marine iguana are a little flatter and a little more paddle-like, whereas the feet of a land iguana are a lot more claw-like. Right, so the marine iguana has these adaptations that make it a lot better at swimming in water. Land iguanas can, by the way, swim in water, but they're way less good at it than the marine iguanas are. Right, so essentially what is going on here is that the land iguanas are the ancestors of the marine iguanas. Right, so a long time ago in the past, millions of years ago in the past, some land iguanas got over to the Galapagos, either because the sea level was lower or because they floated in on a raft of trees or however it happened, they got to the Galapagos Island from the mainland of South America. And once they got there, they said, oh shit, there's not vegetation here for us to eat, right? So the same sorts of plants that they would have ate in South America aren't as present in the Galapagos Islands. So they started spending more time underwater, eating plants out of the ocean. And over time, they developed these features that made them better and better at doing that. They evolved a body shape that makes them better suited for eating plants from underwater. Right, so that's essentially what happened here. And Darwin kind of saw these marine iguanas and saw these land iguanas, and he said, huh, I'll bet that these marine iguanas are a descendant of these land iguanas. And now, not hundreds, but many decades later, if you look at the genetics of these things, it is abundantly clear that these are the descendants of these land iguanas. And so you see that with iguanas. You see that with a lot of the birds that you find on the Galapagos Islands. So the finches, for instance, which are a small type of bird, are really important to Darwin's thinking of all this. So all the finches that are on the Galapagos Islands all came from a single ancestral bird that lives in South America. You find the same thing with a lot of the plants there. You kind of see this subset of things that live in the Galapagos that clearly have ancestors that came from South America. So that's what Darwin found in the Galapagos, and that's in a large part how he came to his thinking about evolution. So after his trip on the boat in the 1840s, he then kind of ruminated on this. So he kind of thought about the things that he found, and he published a very important book. All right. So in 1859, he publishes a book titled "On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection." Arguably the most important, piece of literature written by any biologist ever. And in his book, he makes two really important hypotheses. So the first hypothesis has to do with the first part of the title of the book, on the origin of species, right? So he is saying that existing species descend from older species. So just like you descend from your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents, he hypothesized that whole species actually descend from older species. Specifically, things like marine iguanas descended from land iguanas. So that's one important hypothesis. The second hypothesis was that the mechanism by which this happens is known as natural selection. And we'll come back to that and explain what that means a little bit later on. So it's now been, over 160 years since Darwin first published, that very important book. A huge amount of research has been conducted on evolution. And all of that research has kind of pointed to the fact that Darwin was totally right, which is why Darwin's ideas kind of went from the level of hypothesis to the level of theory. So we learned way back in chapter 1 how hypotheses and theories are different from each other. So a hypothesis is something that's been tested maybe like once or twice or a few times, whereas a theory is something that has been supported by an abundance of evidence. It's been tested many, many, many times, right? So that's why evolution and natural selection, we consider those to be theories because they've been tested so thoroughly by so many researchers over many, many years. So the next part of this chapter that I want to talk about is I want to talk about the things in biology that only make sense when we think about them in the light of evolution. Right. So this is a very famous quote by this guy Theodosius Dobzhansky. And so he said, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Right. So I want you to turn that over in your brain a little bit. So think about what exactly does he mean by this? Right? It's kind of a cryptic, kind of old-fashioned way of constructing a sentence. Uh, but he means something very important by this. And what he is getting at is that when we stop and we look at things that occur in nature, none of them really make sense unless we examine them with the lens of evolution. They don't really make sense unless we think about them in the context of evolution, in the context of things evolving over time. So let's talk about some of the things that only make sense when we consider the fact that they have evolved. So the first thing I want to talk about is DNA. Right? So every single thing on the planet has DNA, right? So all living things have DNA. So bacteria have DNA, viruses have DNA, even though they're technically not alive. Plants have DNA, fungi have DNA, we have DNA, all the other animals have DNA, right? Every single thing has DNA. And everything uses almost an identical genetic code. So do you remember back in chapter 10, we talked about transcription going, and we talked about translation. And translation is where you go from letters of RNA, so A's and C's and U's and G's, and we encode those into amino acids like proline and tryptophan and arginine, right? So that is the genetic code, right? The going between the RNA and the amino acids. So pretty much every living thing on the planet uses that same genetic code, which is crazy, right? So even like the most different things from us on the planet, bacteria, they still use that same genetic code. And so this is, a remarkable thing, but it makes sense when we think about it in terms of evolution, right? So all of the living things on this planet, we all descended from one living thing 3.5 billion years ago, right? So if you go back a long time in the past to 3.5 billion years ago, there were very simple kind of proto-bacteria, so things that kind of came before bacteria. And all of us living things on the planet now, we all descended from that. So we all ended up having DNA and having an identical genetic code, right? So that's something that really only makes sense when we consider it in terms of evolution. Another thing that really only makes sense are fossils, right? So fossils document how things change over time. Right. So if you look at if you look at fossils from say 100 million years ago, the things that you find are very, very different from the things that you find on the planet right now because things have changed around, things have gone extinct, new things have sprung up. So fossils document those changes, right? And those fossils really only make sense if we consider the fact that things change over time, that things evolve. So fossils, like I was saying, they document how things change. They document when things go extinct. And one of my favorite places to see fossils are the La Brea tar pits in California, over in La Brea, kind of at the end of the purple line. In the La Brea tar pits, they document fossils from the Pleistocene, which is the period of time 40 to 11,000 years ago in the past. So it's fossils that were in Southern California from that period of time. And some of the fossils there are really remarkable when you consider the fact that these are things that actually occurred in Los Angeles at one time. So for instance, you see these crazy things in the La Brea tar pits, right? So this, I think probably most of you can tell, is a woolly mammoth or a mastodon. I forget how to tell those two apart. But either way, there are large woolly elephant-like things in Los Angeles, in the Pleistocene. This thing, probably a lot of you can tell, is a saber-toothed cat, right? So that occurred in Los Angeles a long time ago. And this is probably the least recognizable to a lot of you. This is what's known as a giant ground sloth. So this was a huge sloth that was, on the order of like 10 feet tall, and it would walk around on grasslands in North America, including in Los Angeles, back during the Pleistocene. Right, so these crazy things were walking around in Los Angeles, just 11,000 years ago, right? So not that long ago in terms of life on this planet. In fact, there were humans that were in North America at that time, interacting with these things. Of course, these things are all long gone now. Two things kind of did them in. One thing that did them in was the fact that these things really thrived during ice ages, when North America was covered in ice. When that ice goes away, having that thick fur coat isn't so useful anymore. And also us humans kind of found that these things were tasty, and so we were eating a lot of them, and so they kind of went away for that reason too. So if you haven't been to the La Brea tar pits, I totally recommend it because it is really kind of interesting to think about what Los Angeles would have looked like 11,000 years ago when these crazy things were walking around Los Angeles. So another fossil so a fossil that you won't find in the La Brea tar pits is something known as Tiktaalik. So Tiktaalik is a transitional fossil. So this is what the actual fossil looks like. This is in the Field Museum in Chicago. And this is a cartoon renditioning of what Tiktaalik would have looked like. And so Tiktaalik is a transitional fossil, right? So take a look at this cartoon renditioning and think about what transition are we documenting here? What major change in life are we talking about? And so probably a lot of you are looking at this thing and saying, okay, it looks a little bit like a fish, because it's got a tail fin like a fish, but it's got things that are kind of like legs, more like a reptile or an amphibian. And it's got a face that is a lot more like an amphibian or a reptile than a fish. So if you're thinking all those things, you're right. That's exactly what this thing is. So Tiktaalik shows the transition between things with backbones, so fishes, going from being in the water to evolving the ability to live on land. Right, so there's one lineage of fishes that essentially move from water up onto land. And that lineage then gave rise to the amphibians. Those amphibians gave rise to reptiles, and then reptiles gave rise to birds and to mammals like us. So this thing is actually your ancestor, believe it or not. And this thing shows us how we went from there being fishes to being amphibians, right? So a really, really important transition. None of us would exist if it wasn't for this transitional Tiktaalik that occurred something like 350 million years ago in the past. By the way, this crazy word Tiktaalik, that is Inuit. So indigenous people that live in the far north parts of Canada and Alaska. Tiktaalik was first found in those regions. And so the researcher that discovered Tiktaalik, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, he named this fossil Tiktaalik because the Inuit word for amphibian is Tiktaalik. So let's talk a little bit more about Tiktaalik and a little bit more about tetrapods in general. So tetrapod refers to a thing that has 4 feet. So the prefix tetra means 4, and the suffix pod means foot. Right. So we learned about tetrads. So those are like 4 chromosomes that come together. We talked about like tripods. That's a 3-legged thing that holds up a camera. So tetra 4 pod foot. And the fossils of early tetrapods, such as Tiktaalik, demonstrate this transition from water to land. In fact, this is one of the most well-documented like transitions of the major transitions that have occurred on the planet. So if you look at existing fishes like this trout or this coelacanth or this lungfish, they do not have limbs like we do. But if you look at the things that evolved from them, including Tiktaalik, when you look at their limbs, you can see how over time those limbs became more and more limb-like and less fin-like, right? So the fin limb thing of Tiktaalik, then gave rise to something a little more hand-like and a little more and a little more until finally you get to us living tetrapods that very much have arms and legs. And kind of the really fascinating thing about all this is look at the colors of the bones here, so that they're color coded, right? So the bone in the upper part of your arm is the humerus, and all of these transitional animals, they all had a humerus as well. The bone in your lower part of your arm that is kind of extending from your elbow to your wrist, that is the ulna. And these transitional fossils, those things all had ulnas. And then finally, the bone on the lower part of your arm extending from the inside of your elbow to your wrist, that is the radius. And these things all had radii as well. And so over time, these bones kind of shifted around, digits formed, and that's how we went from fins to limbs. Okay, another thing that I want to talk about that only really makes sense when we think about it in the context of evolution is what's known as homology. So the prefix of this word homology, a lot of you will know that means the same. So what homology refers to is similarity or sameness that results from relatedness. So you can think about that in the context of people, for instance, like siblings, right? So siblings are often very similar in their appearance because of relatedness, because they share a lot of the same DNA. So they're similar because they're related. Well, the same thing goes for whole species, right? So species that are closely related to each other will have a lot of similarity because of that relation. Right, so we are going to have a lot more, so humans, for instance, are going to have a lot more similarity to things like cats than we are to fishes, because we're a lot more closely related to cats than we are to fishes. So homologous structures are then things that are similar, even if there's a difference in the function. So let's examine these limbs, for instance, on different mammals, right? So humans, cats, whales, bats, these are all mammals. Right, so things that have fur, and things that the females of the species have mammary glands that are used for feeding juveniles, for feeding offspring. And so if you look at the forelimb of these different things, the same bones are there in all of them. Right, so humans, cats, whales, bats, we all have a humerus. Right, so right there. We all have a radius, right? That's that orange one there. We all have carpals, those are the yellow ones. And we all have digits. In fact, we all have the same number of digits except for a whale, which has lost one of its digits. It has 4 digits instead of 5. Right, so there's a lot of similarity, even though these 4 different things use those limbs for different purposes. So us humans, we use our limbs for writing and for, I don't know, picking up food and throwing basketballs. A cat walks on its 4 limbs. A whale uses its 4 limbs for swimming, and a bat uses them for flying. So even though we use those limbs for different things, the structure of those limbs are very, very similar. simply because we are closely related to these things, right? All of these things here are mammals and are closely related to each other. So kind of an interesting thing is that genes can also be homologous structures, right? So genes as in those bits of DNA that encode certain proteins. And a really good example of this is what's known as the PAX6 gene. So this is a gene that is found in all of the multicellular animals, right? So from things as simple as sponges to things as complex as like us and bears and dogs and fishes, right? So any animal that you can think of has PAX6. And so the reason why we all have PAX6 is because all of the animals are related to each other. So essentially what happened is that the ancestor of all of the animals had PAX6. And that ancestor passed that gene on to the animals that then came after it. You can kind of think of it as like in humans, you can think of like male pattern baldness, right? So if you have like a great grandfather that's bald, he's going to pass that trait onto his kids. And then those kids are going to pass that trait onto their kids, and then passed on to their kids beyond that. It's kind of the same thing as that, but we're talking about whole species, and we're talking about a much longer time scale. So a long, long time ago, probably like 600 or 700 million years ago in the past, the ancestor of animals had PAX6, and it passed PAX6 on to all of the animals that then came about after it. Right, so even something as simple as like a jellyfish or a sponge, it actually has some similarities to you, right? So it has the PAX6 gene just like you do. Oh, and by the way, what PAX6 does is it's involved in the development of eyes, right? So or at least most animals, have the ability to detect light, and PAX6 is involved in that. So if, for instance, you had a mutation on your PAX6 gene, then you would have blindness, and your eyes would not develop in a normal way. So that's what PAX6 is used for. Okay, another thing that really only makes sense when we consider them in the context of evolution is what are known as vestigial structures. So these are structures that are inherited from our ancestors, but no longer serve a function because the lifestyle that we have now is different from the lifestyle that those ancestors had in the past. So probably a lot of you are already thinking of a vestigial structure that occurs in humans, right? So if and maybe some of you have even had complications, medical complications as a result of this vestigial structure. So the appendix is kind of, it's not completely vestigial, but it's as close to a vestigial structure as we have inside of us. So the appendix is something that was useful in the past when our ancestors were eating lots and lots of raw plants. Because our ancestors, didn't have fire. If you go back far enough in time, humans were not cooking things over fire. And what cooking does is it starts to break down our food so it's easier to digest it. So in the past, we didn't have that, meaning that we had to have this appendix thing that helped us to break down raw food that we were eating. In particular, raw plants that have a lot of fiber in it that is really difficult to break down. So we had an appendix that was useful for that. And that appendix essentially held bacteria that would aid in breaking down our food when we were eating all that raw food. So we still do actually use our appendix today. So our appendix still does have bacteria in it that's used for breaking down our food. But a lot of you know that you can actually live quite happily and quite normally without an appendix. In fact, what can happen is if you get the wrong type of bacteria in your appendix, then your appendix can actually rupture. And then all that bad bacteria can spread throughout the rest of your abdominal cavity, which is really dangerous, which can kill you. Which is why if a person has an infected appendix that is inflamed, the most common way of dealing with it is just to remove the appendix. Because like I was saying, you can live without an appendix. You don't need it to survive. And why you don't need it to survive is because you cook your food. right? So unless you're on some sort of like crazy raw vegan diet, most of the food that you're eating is cooked. So you really don't need an appendix anymore. So it's a vestigial structure. Another good example of a vestigial structure is the PAX6 gene in cave fishes. So throughout parts of Central America, like Mexico, for instance, you find these small fishes that live in caves that are in complete darkness. And so because they're in complete darkness, eyes aren't very useful to them. They use their other senses for detecting the world around them. And so what has happened to these fishes is that their PAX6 gene has been has become full of mutations, right? So full of nonsense mutations and substitutions and all the different mutations we talked about, they've got them in their PAX6 genes. So as a result, their eyes never form, right? They never actually produce an eye. But however, they still have the PAX6 gene in their genome, right? So it's still sitting there, but now it's not serving any purpose because it is so filled with mutations that it doesn't actually do anything anymore, right? So it's vestigial. It's still there. They inherit it from their ancestors, but they're no longer using it. It doesn't serve any function to them anymore, right? So that is an example of a vestigial gene in something. Okay, so as I was kind of saying before, there's a lot of evidence that points to Darwin being right, right? And all these things that we talked about, right, like DNA and fossils and vestigial structures and homology, all those things point to Darwin being correct, which is why, like I was saying before, Darwin's two hypotheses have been elevated to the level of theory, right? So that's why we say the theory of evolution in natural selection. We don't say the hypothesis of it, we say the theory of it. And you now know that a theory is essentially scientific fact, right? So a lot of people that are doubters of evolution, they'll say, oh, well, it's just a theory, so it's not like fully supported in science. That's actually not correct. Theories are essentially scientific fact. And there's an overwhelming evidence of Darwin's two ideas, which is why we call them theories. So the next thing I want to talk about is evolutionary trees, because this kind of relates to the origin of species part of the title of Darwin's book. And so evolutionary trees are essentially a way to visualize the history of life in the form of a tree. And in fact, in one of Darwin's notebooks that are in England, he has this picture of an evolutionary tree above which he wrote, "I think." So you can kind of get a glimpse into the mind of Darwin as he was putting together his ideas. In the only figure in his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, the only figure in it is actually an evolutionary tree. Let's take a look at an evolutionary tree and kind of work out what's going on here. So first of all, kind of the best way to think of an evolutionary tree is it's kind of like a family tree, almost kind of like a pedigree, like we talked about in chapter 9. But instead of individuals in it, we're talking about whole species or whole groups of species. And so what you see here is we're going from old on the left to new on the right, right? So there's chronology here. So as you move from left to right, you're going further and further into, or getting closer and closer to the present. So all the way to the left is the present, all the way to the right, sorry, all the way to the right is present, all the way to the left is further ago in the past. And so we see these different groups of species over here. And there's a couple of important things that I want to point out on this tree. So of all of these animals here, right, they all go back to one common ancestor, right? So that term common ancestor is something that I'm going to throw around quite a bit throughout the rest of the chapter. So a common ancestor is essentially the organism that started all of this, right? So before there were all of these things, there was this one organism, this one living thing, this one animal And then from that animal, all of these other things evolved essentially, right? So this thing came first, and then all of these things came later. So that is a common ancestor. Okay, another thing that I want to point out here is that is relatedness between different groups, right? So essentially, the distance that you have to move over the orange line or whatever color that is, the further the distance, the more distantly related they are. So for instance, like, to go from, say, mammals to lizards, right? We go over, we go down, across, up, across to get to lizards. Whereas if we want to go from mammals to lungfish, we have to go back, we have to go keep going further back, up, and all the way across. So we have to go further along the evolutionary tree to get from us to lungfishes than we have to get from us to lizards and snakes. So we are more closely related to things like lizards and snakes than we are to lungfishes. Or like in the case of ostriches, right? They are more closely related to hawks and other birds than they are to, say, mammals, which you have to, go that whole way. So the relatedness here is kind of shown by how far apart the different things are. Okay, another important thing that's on this tree is traits. So we can use an evolutionary tree to figure out which traits evolved at which point in the past. And we can see those homologous traits, so traits that are shared by all groups. So for instance, we know that ostriches and hawks and other birds, we know that those things have feathers, whereas all of these other things don't have feathers. Right? So feathers couldn't have evolved back here because then this common ancestor would have gave feathers to all the things that came about after it. No, instead feathers must have evolved here, sometime after birds split off from crocodiles. Right? So feathers are here, which is why then all of these things have feathers. Limbs, so tetrapod limbs, that must have evolved here because then all of the things that came about after that point, all of those things have limbs. If limbs had evolved here, then lungfishes would have limbs too, but we can see they do not have limbs. So limbs must have evolved somewhere along this lineage here. It couldn't have been back here because then lungfishes would have them too. Probably a lot of you are wondering what the hell amnion refers to. So amnion refers to fluid around a developing offspring or embryo, right? So for instance, in us mammals, right? So when a baby is developing inside of a woman, there's amniotic fluid around it. For these things that have eggs, right? Their eggs have fluid inside of them, right? So the little developing bird or croc or snake or whatever, there's fluid around it inside of the shell. Amphibians don't have that, right? So that's why amnion goes right here. It doesn't go right here. Because if amnion had evolved right here, then amphibians would have it too, but they don't. Okay, so the important things on this tree here is first of all chronology, right? So we're going from old times to present when we go from left to right. Common ancestor is really important. That shows us the thing that would have then gave rise, the animal that would have gave rise to all of these things. Traits are important, and then relatedness is important. Those are the things that are kind of shown by an evolutionary tree. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about natural selection. In fact, that's what we're going to spend the rest of this chapter on, is discussing natural selection. Because that is the kind of the second part of the title of Darwin's book, right? So the title, is a reminder, is On the Origin Species by Means of Natural Selection. So let's talk about how Darwin came to this idea. A lot of it came from the idea of artificial selection. So that is domesticating animals and plants, right? So we, us humans, artificially change around things that are useful to us, right? So for instance, a long time ago, early humans found wild mustard and they started growing them and cultivating them. And from that wild mustard, we now have cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi, We've got all of these different plants that are all ancestors, or all descendants, I should say, of wild mustard, right? So by breeding together things with certain traits, we're able to change around things over time. Probably a lot of you are maybe thinking about this in the context of animals that you have living at home with you, right? So a lot of you might have dogs, and a lot of you might know that the ancestor of those dogs are wolves. But probably very few of you have a thing living with you that looks like a 140-pound wolf. Most of you have dogs that look very different from wolves. And why that is because we have selected them over time, right? So we have selected, we took those ancient wolves and we selected certain traits in them, right? So for instance, we picked the wolves, so we picked and breeded wolves that wouldn't bite our faces off, right? Because that's not something that you want to have in a pet. And we breeded, say, having longer kind of floppy ears. And we breeded having a shorter stature, because a 130-pound wolf is a very expensive thing to own because it eats a lot. It's a lot cheaper to feed, a 10-pound Chihuahua. So wolves, went a long way to become things like Chihuahuas. And how they got that way is through artificial selection, by us breeding certain traits in individuals in order to get the desired results that we wanted. So artificial selection can also have very, very negative effects. An example of this is what's known as MRSA. So MRSA is what's known as a superbug. And I'll write in for you what it stands for. So it stands for resistant Staphylococcus I'm running out of room here. Aureus, A-U-R-E-U-S. So methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. So Staphylococcus aureus is a bacteria. So it is a common infectious bacteria in humans. And methicillin is a type of antibiotic. It's something that we use to fight and kill off bacteria. So methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus means a type of Staphylococcus that will not respond to methicillin. Basically, you can't kill it with methicillin. Methicillin will not work on it. And the reason why that is because it has evolved, right? So methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, essentially what has happened is we've killed off all of the weak Staphylococcus aureus. And what is left is the Staphylococcus that is resistant to methicillin, that can do quite fine around methicillin. And so MRSA is just one example of a superbug. There are many types of superbugs out there that are now resistant to the typical antibiotics that we would use in order to kill it. There's even a type of antibiotic resistant gonorrhea, right? So protect yourself when you're out there, folks, because there's gonorrhea that can't be killed with antibiotics, and you do not want to get that. So let's talk a little bit more now about natural selection rather than artificial selection. So there's kind of two key components to it. So one key component is that there, first of all, is variation among individuals. So say there are tall individuals, medium-sized individuals, and short individuals, right? So that variation is really key. Another really important component is heritability, right? So there has to be at least some transmission of traits from parents to offspring, right? So tall parents have tall kids, medium-sized parents have medium-sized kids, and short parents have short kids, right? So there has to be some amount of heritability. There doesn't have to be complete heritability. There can be some effect of the environment, as we learned about in Chapter 9, but there has to be at least some amount of heritability in order for natural selection to work. So let's talk about variation. Where does that variation come from? Right? Think about that for a second. Why do different humans have different, sets of DNA inside of us, right? Why do you not have the same exact DNA as, say, one of your siblings? right? So the answer for that is mutations, right? So we learned about mutations back in chapter 10, how mutations are changes to the code of DNA. In over the 3.5 billion years that there have been living things on this planet, there's been a lot of time for mutations to come about in populations of living things. Okay, so now I want to show you and talk to you about the second part of the title of Darwin's book, right? So the first part was on the origin of species by means of natural selection. But the second part of the title that far fewer people know about is this thing down here, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life, was the second part of the title of his book. Right, so what Darwin is getting at here is that there are limited resources in the environment, so living things have to struggle to survive. Right, so maybe not so much, us now, in a pretty developed, country where we have grocery stores and we don't have large predators running around eating us. For us humans, in a developed country, life is pretty easy. But for something like, I don't know, a fish, life is not so easy because you have to find food, you have to not get eaten, you have to find things to reproduce with. It's a struggle. Life is a struggle for things that live in the wild. And that struggle for life is going to lead to the fact that only some individuals, and so this gets at the kind of racist sounding part of the title, the favored races part. What Darwin, I think, was getting at here was more individuals than like races, like black people or Asian people or white people. I mean, to be fair, Darwin was, a white guy living in the middle 1800s, so he was certainly incredibly racist by our standards today. But I don't think he was inherently talking about, I don't think he was inherently being racist in naming the book this. So what he's getting at is that certain individuals have good traits. And those traits make them good at surviving and good at having offspring. And so it's only those individuals that have those useful traits that are going to then pass those traits on to their offspring, right? So say you're in a population of fishes, and some fishes have crummy little fins that make it very hard for them to get away from predators, right? So those fishes are less likely to survive, which means they're less likely to pass that trait of crummy little fins onto offspring, meaning that over time, less and less of the fish in the population are going to have those crummy little fins. And over time, more and more fish are going to have larger fins that are more useful for getting away from predators. Right? So what he's getting at here, just to reiterate, is that life is a struggle, and only individuals with favorable traits can actually navigate through life and survive and have offspring. And it's those individuals that the population is going to become more and more like over time. Individuals that don't have good traits are going to become more and more rare in a population over time. So what we're getting at here with natural selection is that nature, meaning the environment around us, it selects for traits that makes a living thing, a plant or a bird or an animal or whatever, it makes them better able to survive and pass those traits on to their kids, on to their offspring. So if you have those traits, great, you survive, you pass them on to your offspring, and then next year, slightly more individuals in the population have those traits. Whereas if you have crappy traits, then you are less likely to survive, so you're less likely to pass them on. So next year, the population has slightly fewer individuals with those crappy traits. So some of the traits that are really, really important for survival and really important in terms of evolution is anything related to finding food, escaping predators, and finding mates. Right? So this cheetah is obviously doing something right here, right? It looks like it's about to get a meal. And so, maybe this cheetah is likely to pass whatever good traits it has on to its offspring. Maybe this is a particularly fast cheetah, or maybe it's a really cunning cheetah, or maybe this cheetah blends in really, really well with the grassland that it's living in. So it's going to survive and pass those traits onto its offspring. So next year, and in the future going forward, more and more cheetahs are going to have traits like this one. Whereas this poor little impala clearly is not doing a good job here, right? In the game of life, its life is a major struggle as this photo is being taken, right? So this poor little impala obviously has some traits that has made it not so good at surviving. Maybe this impala was inclined to wander away from its herd. Or maybe this impala was just loud and obnoxious and very noticeable to predators. Either way, whatever crummy traits it has that has led it to being in this situation, it's not going to pass on to its offspring, because clearly this impala is not going to survive and not going to have offspring. So in years going forward, fewer and fewer impalas are going to have the crummy traits that this particular impala had. And then traits that allows one to find mates is very important too, because even if this cheetah is doing a really good job of eating this impala, if this cheetah is not very desirable to other cheetahs in a sexual romantic way, then this cheetah is not going to pass its traits onto its offspring, because it's not going to have any offspring because no other cheetahs are willing to have sex with it. So finding mates is very, very important. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit when we talk about something known as sexual selection. So I want to talk about one of the best examples we have of natural selection. And it goes on with the finches of the Galapagos Island, which I mentioned a little while ago. So these are what are commonly known as Darwin's finches. And a couple of scientists in the 1970s by the name of Peter and Rosemary Grant, they did some incredibly important research on natural selection of a particular species of finch on a particular island in the Galapagos known as Daphne Major. So they were studying something known as medium ground finches on this particular island. And so the important thing to know about ground finches is that they have beaks, and they use those beaks in order to crush seeds, which is their preferred food. And so some finches might have a beak that is this shape. All right, so there's my angry bird finch with that beak. And some finches have a beak that looks more like this. Right, so the difference that you see there is in what's known as the depth of the beak. Right, so this bird has a really deep beak. This bird has a really shallow beak. If you look at that distance, maybe this one is, say, like, I don't know, 10 centimeters, and this one has a beak of, say, just like 3 centimeters. So the depth of the beak is really important because it determines what seeds you can eat. If you have a really, really deep beak like this, that's great for crushing large seeds, but it's really bad at handling and manipulating tiny seeds. Whereas if you have a beak like this bird down here, you're really bad at crushing big seeds, but you're really good at manipulating and handling tiny little seeds. Okay, so that's what's going on with the finches. So let's talk about climate a little bit. So 1976, 1977, 1978, this is showing the rainfall that was on the island. So what you see is in that middle year there, 1977, there was a major drought on the island. So there was way, way less water available. That had a big effect on the vegetation, which you see in this graph here. And so what this is showing is in this kind of greenish color, that is the abundance of seeds. And in the orange, that is showing the toughness of seeds. So what you see is between 1976, where there was a lot of water, which is here, in 1977, when there was very little water, very little rainfall, the abundance of seeds went down by about half. So there's only about half the amount of seeds that there was before. And the seeds that were available got a lot tougher, right? So we went from relatively easy to break open seeds to tougher, bigger seeds. So what does that mean? It means that the birds with these deep beaks, that's great for them because they can crack these tough seeds. But these birds with the shallow beaks, that's not such a good thing because now they have a beak that is really ill-equipped for breaking open those tough seeds. So from 1976 to 1977, there was a huge die-off in the finches. So something like 85% of all the finches on the island died. So it was a bad time to be a finch on Daphne Major. But of the 15% that did survive, when you look at them then in 1978, so after the drought, you see that the depth of the beak has increased over time. So the beak has gotten larger over time. The reason being is that all of these individuals, all of the individuals with these really shallow beaks, right, they're all dead. Whereas the individuals that had the larger beaks, they were able to survive. So essentially what has happened here is that nature has selected for these individuals, right? So for the individuals that have those deeper beaks, nature has essentially said, okay, good for you guys. You've got the right, shape here, so you can survive. Whereas these guys, you guys with the thin beaks, with the really shallow beaks, sucks to be you, you're dead. So these ones don't survive, don't have offspring. These ones do. And as a result, the average size of the beak has increased from 1976 to 1978. Right, so like I was saying before, this is one of the best examples of natural selection because it's an example that you could actually study within your lifetime, right? So we're talking about natural selection and evolution in just 3 years, 1976 to 1978. There was a change even in that short period of time. So you can imagine if there was a noticeable change just in those 3 years, you can imagine, natural selection working over millions and millions and millions of years that life has been on the planet. And now you can kind of start to see why it is that there's so many different things on the planet that have so many different shapes and sizes and such. It's because natural selection can work really quickly sometimes. Okay, I wanted to make sure that you didn't have any, I wanted to dispel any myths that you might have about natural selection. Uh, one kind of myth, or more maybe not myth, but maybe more like misunderstanding about natural selection is that natural selection has an effect on individuals, but it's whole populations that evolve, right? So those finches that we just talked about, certainly for individuals that has a big effect. Because if you had that shallow beak, then you starve to death, which sucks. Uh, but it's the whole population that actually evolved. The whole population changed. So the average beak size changed from 1976 to 1978. So natural selection affects individuals, but whole populations evolve. It can only work on heritable traits, right? So something like political affiliation cannot, evolve in a typical natural selection framework, right? Because it's not as if every person that is a Republican only has Republican kids. My parents, found that out the hard way with me certainly, and so because of that, it can't evolve over time, because it's not as if more people that are Republicans reproduce, then there'll be more Republicans. No, that's not the case because some of those kids of those Republicans are going to be Democrats, and some of the kids of Democrats are going to be Republicans or socialists or in the Green Party or whatever. So it only works with heritable traits. Another really important thing about natural selection is that it's not as if it has an end goal. So it's not as if natural selection is like striving to make this perfect animal or this perfect plant. All it is really doing is just taking the variation that exists and just kind of shaping it so that it can work best, so that that animal or plant works best with this environment. Uh, I think a really good analogy for this is sculpting. So say you've got a piece of granite, and you're a sculptor, and you're essentially, taking off some of the granite, you're taking off some of the rock, in removing variation essentially, and eventually making something that works pretty well or looks pretty nice. Uh, However, if the piece of granite that you started with is misshapen, then that means that the end product is going to be kind of misshapen. And so natural selection, doesn't strive for something that's perfect. What it really just does, it takes the variation that is there, it takes the shape of that, say, initial piece of granite, and it just kind of works with it to remove, the variation, remove those unfavorable traits, and produce something that is pretty good for the environment that it's in. Okay, one last important thing one important aspect of natural selection is that it's context dependent, right? So what is useful and great in one context can be not so great or even really bad in another context. So consider, for instance, those animals we talked about in the La Brea tar pit back at the beginning, right? So we talked about those saber-toothed cats, and we talked about woolly mammoths, and we talked about ground sloths, right? All those things are dead now. And the reason they're dead now is because the traits that they had were really good for the context of an ice age in North America. When that ice age went away, now having all that thick fur, suddenly is really bad, because now, you have this thick fur coat, and you're dying of heat exhaustion, and so that's not so good. So what is useful in one context becomes really not very useful in another context. Okay, another aspect of natural selection that I want to discuss uh, is the fact that natural selection works within populations. So first, let's define a population. So it is a group of individuals that are of the same species, and they all occur in the same area, right? So consider, for instance, like Echo Park Lake, right? Inside of Echo Park Lake, there are a bunch of diamondback terrapins, which are not diamondback. There's a bunch of red-eared sliders, which are types of turtles. All those turtles, all living in Echo Park Lake, they make up a population because they're all of the same species and they're all of this in the same area. So a really important aspect of natural selection is that when you have populations that are isolated from each other, they can actually evolve in different ways, right? So natural selection will cause them to change around in different ways. And freshwater fish are a really good example of this. So these fish that you see here, these are known as three-spined stickleback. I'll write that down for you. Okay, so they are these kind of ugly little fish that only a mom could love because they're so ugly. And what goes on with them is that you find these stickleback in different lakes throughout North America. And you will find that stickleback in different lakes that are isolated from each other have evolved different shapes. And why they evolve different shapes is because some lakes, have predators, have like large fish predators. Some lakes have bird predators. Some lakes have both birds and fishes, and some lakes have none. So if you are a three-spine stickleback that lives in a lake where there's a lot of predators, you probably want to have a shape kind of like this. So big spines and these bony plates on your side. That makes you less likely to get eaten by a fish or a bird. Whereas if you're a three-spine stickleback in a lake that doesn't have any predators, you want a shape kind of like this, right? So you don't have all these spines and all these bony plates that are great for protecting yourself, but aren't really necessary if there aren't any predators around. So these different populations of stickleback in different lakes will evolve different shapes, depending on whatever nature selects for, that's what they tend to evolve. Okay, I want to talk uh, about the three kind of ways that natural selection can shape a population. So let's say we've got a population of mice uh, that have a shade of colors, where you have some really dark ones, some kind of gray ones in the middle, and then some really light ones. And so this is actually a real world example. Um, and so let's say, for instance, of these different possible phenotypes from light to dark, let's say originally there's a bell-shaped curve, meaning that most individuals have this average shape, right? So that this average color, where most individuals are gray, fewer individuals are really dark or really light, right? And so we have this bell-shaped curve, which, by the way, is the type of curve that you would find for most traits. So if you looked at human height, for instance, most humans are like somewhere in the middle. Very few humans are as tall as Manute Bol, and very few humans, are as short as Bugsy Mogs. Most individuals are kind of in the middle. So one thing that natural selection can do is it can shift a whole population in one direction, right? So what we see here is this is what the original bell curve looked like, and you can see the whole thing is shifted over to the right. Right, so let's think about what might have caused this circumstance. Uh, and so what caused this is essentially all of those really light individuals are now gone, right? They all died for some reason. Let's say, for instance, these mice occur in an area where there was just a lava flow. And lava rock is really dark, right? So like dark black. And so now all the rocks that these mice hide in are all of a really dark color, in which case that really light colored mouse sticks out like a sore thumb, and is more likely to get eaten than one of these dark mice. So that's why all those light mice are gone. They basically all got eaten, right? So that's directional selection. The whole thing is shifted in one direction. Sometimes you can have what's known as disruptive selection, where essentially the individuals in the middle, they have all disappeared. And now we only have really light individuals or really dark individuals. And this is what you find in certain populations of mice in the American Southwest. So in parts of the Southwest, you will find really dark volcanic rock, and you'll find really light sandstone rock. So in those areas, it's good to be either dark so you can blend in with the dark volcanic rock, or light so you can blend in with the sandstone rock. If you're in the middle, you don't blend in with anything, and you're a goner because now you're going to stick out because there's no rock in which you can blend in with. So that's called disruptive selection, where this bell curve has been disrupted, and now we have two curves essentially. Finally, there's what's known as stabilizing selection. And what happens there is essentially all the light individuals, are gone, all the dark individuals are gone. What we're left with is just the ones in the middle. So say you're in an area where all of the rocks are of a gray color, right? In that circumstance, to be really dark sucks, to be really light also sucks. So those dark and those light individuals are dead, they get eaten. What we're left with is only the gray ones. So that the curve is essentially stabilized, which is why we call it stabilizing selection. Okay, I want to talk about two other mechanisms that can occur that can cause things to change. Right, so we've talked about how natural selection can cause a population to change over time, but there's a couple other mechanisms that can also cause a population to change, to evolve. So we have natural selection, but then there's also something known as genetic drift, which can cause a change in a population, in the genes in a population, just due to random chance, right? So there's nothing to do with like good traits and bad traits. It's just completely due to random chance. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say that we have a field of flowers that are red and white, and they have two different alleles. They have the capital R allele, which makes it red, and a lowercase r allele, which makes it white. And in this first year, this first generation, the ratio of red to white is 7:3, right? So if you count up all the capital R alleles, and you count up all the lowercase r alleles, they occur in a ratio of 0.7 to 0.3, right? So for every 7 capital R alleles, there are 3 lowercase r alleles. And so I think most of you know how flowers tend to reproduce. It's done with the birds and the bees and all that. So a bee will go to one flower, pick up some pollen off the stamen. Pollen has DNA in it, and then it will go to another flower and deposit that pollen into the female parts of that other flower. So that's how they reproduce. But the interesting thing about most bees is they can't actually see red light. So they lack the machinery in their eyes to tell apart red light from other colors. So to a bee, a red flower, a white flower doesn't really make a difference, right? It all looks the same to them. So bees just kind of go around from flower to flower to flower. It doesn't really matter to them whether they're going to white flowers or red flowers. They just go around randomly from one flower to the next. Right? So it's not as if having a red flower is better than having a white flower. So let's say in this first year, in this first spring, bees just happen to visit this flower, in this flower, in this flower, in this flower, in this flower. Right? So those are the only ones that reproduce. So if we count up the alleles of those flowers, right, we see that there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big R alleles go into the next year. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lowercase r alleles are going to make it to the next year. Right? So in the next year, that next spring, now the ratio of big R to little r is going to be 0.5 to 0.5. Right? So for every 5 capital R red alleles, there's going to be 5 lowercase r white alleles. Right? And if you count up here, like the number of capital R's and lowercase r's, they're going to be even. Okay, so let's say this next year the bees are really, really lazy, and they just happen to visit this flower and this flower. Right? So let's look at the alleles that are going to get passed on to the next generation. Right? All we see is capital R alleles, right? So what is this population of flowers going to look like next year? It's going to look like this. There's only going to be capital R alleles because it just so happened, just from random chance, that none of the lowercase r alleles happen to make it to the next generation. Right? So we see a change in a population over time, but not one that is due to like favorable traits and crappy traits. It really just happened to do with random chance, right? So even though, natural selection works to make living things as best suited for the environment as it possibly can, there's a lot of random chance involved. In another year, there could be a fire, in this area and all these flowers are dead. Or maybe in the next year, maybe there's bee colony collapse and no bees happen to visit this area. Right? There's all this random stuff that goes on in nature that has nothing to do with natural selection. And what we kind of collectively call that is genetic drift. So genetic drift is then kind of related to what's known as the founder effect and what's known as the bottleneck effect. So the founder effect and the bottleneck effect, they pretty much describe the same thing. And so they describe how when you take a large population that has a lot of genes in it, a lot of variation in it, if say something happens where only a few individuals survive, now there's going to be way less variation among those individuals than there were in the past, which is why we use the analogy of a bottleneck. So let's say we have a population that is shown by this, where we have these marbles, and the marbles are of different colors. So those different colors represent different traits of individuals in that population. Let's say, for instance, something really bad happens to that population. So only 5 of them survive. When you just take a random drawing of 5 of these marbles, it's very possible that you might miss one whole type of trait. In this case, that orange marble went missing. So now in this new population, now that orange trait is completely gone. So when this population gets larger again over time, now it's going to look very different from how it did in the past because now that orange trait is completely gone. And a really fascinating example of this happened with humans on an island off the coast of Massachusetts. right? So what you're looking at here is part of the east coast of the United States. So this is part of Massachusetts. So like the capital, Boston, is up here. I grew up down here. The Patriots played down here. This is Cape Cod, where like the Kennedys and all those like rich, famous people hang out. And this is what's known as Martha's Vineyard. So it's a small island off the coast of Massachusetts. And what happened is when European settlers, so mainly English European settlers, when they settled into Martha's Vineyard, there wasn't a whole lot of them. There was maybe like a couple dozen people. And it just so happened that of those couple dozen people, one of them happened to be deaf, right? So just by random chance, one of those people were deaf. So when that population of a couple dozen people, when those people started, having kids and expanding the population, it ended up being the case that there was lots and lots of deaf people on this island simply because one of the founders, right? So that's why it's called founder effect. One of those founders happened to be deaf. And so as a result, then there were lots and lots of deaf people on the island. Even though if you went to just the mainland of Massachusetts, you'd find the typical amount of deaf people, maybe say one in a couple thousand people were deaf. Whereas in parts of Martha's Vineyard, even up until like 100 years ago, there was 1 in 4 people were deaf, which is crazy. Can you imagine that? 1 in 4 people around you cannot hear you, are deaf. Right, so it was a pretty major thing, a major part of life on the island, and it was such a major thing that they actually developed their own version of American Sign Language on the island, that people up until even just a couple of decades ago could still actually speak. And even people that could hear would still know how to speak that version of sign language because there was so many deaf people around them. In order to be able to communicate with all the humans around them, they had to be able to speak both English and they had to be able to speak American Sign Language or their version of American Sign Language. So that is an example of the founder effect, where if you colonize a new area with just like a very small number of individuals, the peculiarities of the genetics of that small group of individuals is going to get expanded when the population gets bigger. And so because there happened to be one person that was deaf of that original colony of Europeans on Martha's Vineyard, then you ended up with tons and tons of people in Martha's Vineyard that were deaf, in the years following. Okay, one last thing that I want to talk about that is kind of another way that things can evolve is what's known as sexual selection, right? So sexual, of course, implies reproduction, and that's what we're getting at here, is that individuals that have certain traits, sometimes those traits make them more likely to find a mate and to have offspring. And there is absolutely no better example of this than the birds of paradise that one finds in Papua New Guinea. So I will put up some videos in the course module of videos of birds of paradise, doing elaborate things in order to attract mates. And kind of the idea behind all of this is that individuals, particularly males of species, will oftentimes have very exaggerated traits that are meant to attract members of the other sex in order to reproduce. And how this kind of works is that if an individual, say a peacock, for instance, is a classic example of this, where peacock males have all these bright tail feathers. So if a peacock male is just so good at surviving, so good at finding food, and so good at avoiding predators, then it can afford to do all these things, even despite having the handicap of having this really bright set of feathers, right? Because a whole bunch of bright feathers makes you a lot more noticeable to a predator. But if you're so fit and so good and so healthy that you can survive even despite having those bright feathers, then that is an indication that you are really healthy. And so the bright feathers of a male peacock is an indication to the female peacocks that say, hey, I'm healthy enough that I've been able to survive, even having this handicap of all these super bright, really obnoxious feathers. And females will see that male and say, whoa, hubba hubba, that male obviously is doing something right because even though he has all these bright feathers, he's still able to survive, despite that huge handicap. So maybe I want my kids to have those same good traits that that male must have. So that's what you find in birds. You find it in a lot of different animals. One of my favorite examples are these small crabs known as fiddler crabs. And with fiddler crabs, the males have one large claw and one small claw. And the large claw is only useful for attracting mates because it can't be used for feeding. It can't be used really for anything. So males that have really large claws have to overcome that handicap of having that large claw that is useless to them. And so females will see that large claw and they'll say, "Well, he must be doing something good because he's been able to survive despite this huge handicap." So that's the male that I want to reproduce with because he's got good traits and I want my kids to have good traits. And that's essentially how sexual selection works. Okay, so that was a long video lecture. Hopefully you took some pauses in between there to take notes and such. So in the next chapter, we're going to get into kind of the larger processes of evolution.